December 24, 1999. A peaceful holiday flight turned into one of the most terrifying hijackings in modern history. 179 innocent passengers, trapped between life and death. From the skis of Kathmandu to the deserts of Kandahar, the world watched in fear as diplomacy, terror, and politics collided. This is not just a story of a hijacked plane. It's the story of how one decision changed South Asian history forever. Welcome to History of Global English, where we uncover the moments that shook the world. The IC-814 Kandahar hijacking, a detailed history. Below is a long-form, carefully sourced history of Indian Airlines Flight IC-814, the December 1999 hijacking that became known as the Kandahar hijack. I've woven a chronological narrative with background, the day-by-day events, key actors, political fallout, and the longer-term consequences. Where it's especially load-bearing, I've added citations to reliable reporting and official material. Executive Summary, fast read. On 24 December 1999, Indian Airlines Flight IC-814, an Airbus A300, VTDW flying from Kathmandu to Delhi, was hijacked by 5 armed men. Over the next 8 days, the aircraft was flown to Amritsar, Lahore, Dubai, and finally Kandahar, then Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. Under pressure, the Indian government negotiated a release and flew 3 jailed militants, including Masood Azhar, to Kandahar on 31 December. In exchange, the hostages were freed. One passenger, Rupin Katyal, was murdered early in the ordeal. The incident had immediate political repercussions in India, raised questions about intelligence and crisis management, and through the eventual release of Masood Azhar, had grave long-term security consequences across the region. Background: why context matters. The late 1990s in South Asia were a period of intense cross-border militancy and political friction. Kashmir insurgency groups, Pakistan-based Islamist militants, and the evolving influence of transnational jihadist networks, including figures who would later be linked to al-Qaeda, created an environment in which militant groups sought high-impact actions to press political demands and secure the release of imprisoned cadres. Hijackings, kidnappings, and prisoner exchange demands were a tactic used to force concessions by states that publicly claimed a policy of not negotiating with terrorists, a policy that would be tested by IC-814. The hijackers identified themselves with Harkatul Mujahideen/Harkatul Ansar networks. Many of the prisoners they demanded were Pakistanis or Pakistan-linked. The aircraft, crew, and passengers. The aircraft was an Indian Airlines Airbus A300 registration VTDW, operating flight IC-814 from Tribhuvan International Airport, Kathmandu, to Indira Gandhi International Airport, New Delhi. There were 179 passengers and 11 crew on board, including the experienced Captain Davy Sharon, often credited with calm leadership during the ordeal. The flight departed Kathmandu on the afternoon of 24 December 1999. Within around 40-50 minutes of takeoff, the hijack unfolded. The hijacking, how it began, 24 December 1999. Around 16:39 IST, while the aircraft was in Indian airspace, a masked man armed with a revolver and a grenade forced access to the cockpit area. The crew soon realized they were being hijacked. Delhi ATC was informed at roughly 16:56 IST. The 5 hijackers, believed to be members of Harkatul Mujahideen, took control and forced the captain to fly west instead of east towards Delhi. One passenger, Rupin Katyal, was stabbed and later died. Survivors reported violence and threats on board in the early hours. Initially, the aircraft landed at Amritsar, India, for refueling and then, under coercion and threat, proceeded to Lahore, Pakistan. Thereafter, the plane went to Dubai and finally to Kandahar on December 25, 1999, a region under Taliban control at that time. Throughout this movement, the hijackers issued demands and attempted to use the plane and hostages as leverage. Timeline day by day. Day 1, 24 December 1999, hijack, Amritsar, Lahore. The hijacking began shortly after departure from Kathmandu. The pilots were ordered to fly west. The plane landed in Amritsar and later in Lahore. Early attempts at negotiation were made by Indian officials, but the situation rapidly escalated as the plane left Indian airspace. The Delhi Crisis Management Group, CMG, the government body responsible for coordinating response, was eventually convened, but criticism later focused on the initial delay in information flow and the handling of the early crisis. Days 2-3, 25-26 December 1999, Dubai, en route to Kandahar. From Lahore, the aircraft was routed to Dubai, where limited contact with officials occurred and some discussions about demands began. The hijackers eventually insisted on being flown to Kandahar, Afghanistan. The plane landed there on 25 December, placing it under the protection of the local Taliban authorities who were in de facto control of Kandahar airport. The presence of the Taliban would prove decisive in determining how the crisis ended. The Taliban mediated and guarded the aircraft, but insisted on keeping negotiations under their oversight. Days 4-7, 26-30 December 1999, Kandahar negotiations. Inside Kandahar, the hijackers issued a list of demands that changed over time, but central among them was the release of dozens of prisoners detained in India. Initially large figures and lists, reportedly up to 36 prisoners at one point, later distilled to a much smaller number. Negotiations involved Indian government representatives, including senior officials and a delegation of negotiators. The Taliban acted as both guard and interlocutor. Media coverage, domestic political pressure from relatives of the hostages, and the evolving tactics of the hijackers shaped a tense, high-stakes negotiation environment. Day 8, 31 December 1999, exchange and release. After intense negotiation, India agreed to send 3 prisoners to Kandahar in exchange for the hostages. The 3 released militants were Mushtaq Ahmed Zargar, a Kashmir separatist, Ahmed Omar Seed Sheikh, a British national of Pakistani origin, and Maulana Masood Azhar, then associated with Harkatul Ansar. India's foreign minister, Jaswant Singh, flew to Kandahar and delivered the freed men to the Taliban. The hostages were released and flown back to India by the end of 31 December. The release of Masood Azhar in particular would later be seen as a pivotal decision, with major security consequences in the region. The hijackers, identities and affiliations. Investigations identified 5 hijackers tied to Pakistan-based militant networks such as Harkatul Mujahideen, Harkatul Ansar. Their exact identities and later fates were the subject of multiple probes and sometimes conflicting reports. Some hijackers are believed to have melted back into Pakistan or Afghanistan, while others were detained or killed in later counter-terror operations. The operation displayed both local militants, operational capacity to carry out an international hijack, and the degree of regional protection, whether tacit or explicit, that could be found in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan at the time. The demands, what the hijackers wanted. Initially, the hijackers issued broad demands including the release of many prisoners, reportedly up to 36, and even monetary ransom. Over time, after Taliban mediation and negotiations, the central demand crystallized around the release of Masood Azhar and others. Reports and later official statements showed that many of the prisoners whose release had been demanded were Pakistanis or Pakistan-linked. Only one was an Indian Kashmiri militant. The hijackers also initially sought the coffin of Sajid Afghani, a deceased militant, and other unusual demands, but talks and Taliban advice shaped and narrowed their requests. India's negotiators ultimately accepted a prisoner exchange with 3 specific militants. Why India agreed: political and human pressures. India faced an agonizing choice: refuse to negotiate and risk hostages, lives, or concede to demands and set a precedent of giving up prisoners to militants. Political pressure from relatives of hostages, the human life imperative, and concerns about the safety of 155 Indian passengers led the government to opt for a negotiated settlement. India's official line was that the state had to secure the lives of its citizens. Critics later argued that giving in emboldened militants and had far-reaching consequences. Internally, criticism focused on intelligence failures, procedural lapses, and the apparent lack of cohesive early crisis handling. The exchange and the men released. The 3 men released from Indian custody were significant figures. Masood Azhar, associated with Harkatul Ansar at the time. After his release, he later founded Jaish-e-Mohammed (GM), an organization that claimed responsibility for several major attacks in India, including high-profile assaults in the 2000s and 2010s. His release is widely regarded by analysts as a strategic setback for India's long-term security. Omar Saeed Sheikh, a British-born militant who was later implicated in major crimes, most notoriously the kidnapping and murder of journalist Daniel Pearl in 2002. His later arrest and trials are part of a grim chain of events linking the IC-814 outcomes to subsequent attacks. Mushtaq Ahmed Zargar and/or other cadre naming sometimes varies in reportage. A Kashmiri militant whose release was part of the negotiated swap. Official lists, statements, and later reporting provide the clearest names and consequences. The release of Azhar remains the single most consequential outcome of the exchange. Immediate fallout: politics, intelligence, and public reaction. The release prompted intense political debate and criticism in India. Questions were raised about intelligence and preparedness. How were weapons smuggled aboard the flight? Why did early lines of information break down? Why was there not a more robust, faster response? Investigations pointed to lapses and failures in coordination between agencies. Negotiation policy. India's de facto decision to accede to a prisoner exchange contradicted decades of public posture of non-negotiation. Critics argued that it set a dangerous precedent. Diplomacy and regional relations. Pakistan denied official involvement, but Pakistani nationals and Pakistan-based militants' roles complicated bilateral ties. The Taliban's role in providing sanctuary to the hijackers and later guarding the exchange further strained relations with India and the broader international community. International reactions. Law, diplomacy, and the Taliban. At the time, the Taliban were internationally isolated, but controlled large parts of Afghanistan, including Kandahar. Their willingness to host and protect the hijackers and to facilitate the exchange was a stark demonstration of how non-state and quasi-state actors could influence international crises. Many countries condemned hijacking and demanded stronger global cooperation to prevent and respond to such acts, but operational responses were constrained by on-the-ground realities in Afghanistan and by political complexities vis-à-vis Pakistan. The episode intensified international scrutiny of militant networks in South Asia. Long-term consequences. Masood Azhar and militant networks. The release of Masood Azhar is widely seen as a turning point. After his release, he is credited with founding Jaish-e-Mohammed (GM), which became one of the most active Pakistan-based militant groups targeting India, implicated in major attacks including the 2001 Indian Parliament attack, whose planning has connections to cross-border networks, and later incidents such as the Pulwama attack in 2019. Analysts link the empowerment and reorganization of militant groups in this era directly to the IC-814 outcome. In effect, conceding to the hijackers, Demand had measurable downstream impacts on regional security for decades. Omar Sheik's later role in Daniel Pearl's kidnapping and murder in Pakistan is another grim thread connecting IC-814 to later events. Sheik's release from Indian custody and his subsequent activities illustrated how swapped militants could re-engage in lethal operations. Investigations and accountability. Post-crisis investigations and parliamentary inquiries focused on operational missteps, intelligence failures, and policy choices. Some officials were criticized for their handling of the crisis. Broader lessons were drawn about airport security, pre-boarding checks, in-flight security, interagency coordination, and crisis leadership. The episode catalyzed changes in airport and airline security in India and led to greater emphasis on intelligence integration, though critics argue not all lessons were learned quickly enough. Official statements and oversight hearings, including statements by the Ministry of External Affairs and parliamentary scrutiny, documented the government's rationale and the logistical steps taken during negotiations. Cultural memory, books, films, and debates. Several books, documentaries, and dramas have revisited the IC-814 hijacking. Journalistic accounts and eyewitness books, e.g., 173 Hours in Captivity by Nilesh Misra, produced immediate contemporary narratives. Later dramatizations and series, including 2024 Netflix dramatization IC-814. The Kandahar hijack revisited the incident with creative framing, sparking renewed debate about accuracy, representation, and historical responsibility. These cultural treatments sometimes provoked controversy. Survivors, analysts, and officials criticized dramatized versions that they felt misrepresented events or downplayed certain actors' roles. The recent Netflix series, for instance, drew legal action and political pushback over its depiction of certain real people and institutions. Security lessons, aviation and beyond. IC-814 highlighted vulnerabilities that were incorporated into later aviation security protocols. Pre-boarding and in-flight security, stricter weapon screening, reinforced cockpit procedures, and better crew training for hijack scenarios. Intelligence sharing, need for faster, better coordinated intelligence flows between civil aviation authorities, national intelligence agencies, and counterterrorism units to detect threats before boarding. Negotiation protocols. Many countries revisited their approaches to negotiation with hostage takers and developed clearer crisis communication strategies to balance life-saving imperatives with long-term security risks. Regional counterterror cooperation. The incident reinforced calls for improved international cooperation to track movement of militants across porous borders and to hold sanctuary-providing actors accountable. What became of the hijackers? Public reporting and later counterterror operations indicated that some hijackers returned to Pakistan or Afghanistan or were later killed in separate operations. The precise fate of each individual remains partially opaque due to the murky nature of militant networks, conflicting intelligence accounts, and the chaos of subsequent counterterror campaigns. Some individuals linked to IC-814 were implicated in later militant acts or were tracked in intelligence dossiers. Others disappeared from public view. The murky accountability surrounding the operatives compounded public anger and political fallout. Comparison with other hijackings, why Kandahar was notable. What makes IC-814 unusually consequential among modern hijackings is not merely the violence or the hostage count, but the political outcome, the release of high-value militants, and the long-term strategic consequences. Where many states now publicly adopt a non-negotiation stance, IC-814 forced a testing of that stance and produced a tangible empowerment of militant leadership, e.g., Masood Azhar. The event thus stands as a stark case study in how tactical concessions in a hostage crisis can reconfigure strategic threats for years to come. Selected primary sources and reporting, key references. Indian Airlines Flight 814, encyclopedic summary and timeline. Britannica entry, overview and timeline of hijacking. Official Indian Ministry of External Affairs statement, summary of negotiations and prisoners demanded. Contemporary and retrospective journalism, Dawn Herald, NDTV, India Today, Reuters. Eyewitness accounts, political fallout and later developments. Scholarly executive summaries and case studies, e.g., crisis reports and academic summaries. Concluding reflections. The IC-814 hijacking is a stark reminder of the complexity of counterterrorism decisions, where immediate human lives and longer-term strategic security are placed in tension. The choice to prioritize hostages, immediate survival by releasing militants produced tangible human relief at the time. Hundreds of lives were saved that day. But the downstream effects, most notably the release of Masood Azhar and the empowerment of militant networks, had tragic consequences in the years that followed. The incident forced improvements in aviation security and crisis management, but also remains a painful lesson about how concessions in a crisis can echo for decades. 8 days of fear, 1 life lost, hundreds scarred forever. And the release of a man who would later create a new wave of terror. The IC-814 hijacking wasn't just a tragedy. It was a turning point that rewrote the map of global terrorism. If you believe history must never be forgotten, subscribe to History of Global English. Because understanding